Hey everybody, John Fenn here. I tried a second ago for the few of you who were on just to make sure this was actually going live, because last time I did this, Facebook would not allow me to post it live and would not allow me to forward it. So we had to backtrack because YouTube is far easier to work with. Anyway, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org is our website today, talking about detours in life, and famine in the land does not necessarily mean you missed it. Now, I want to tell you a story back from June of 1986 in my own life. I was an associate pastor in an unpaid position, but I was expected to be brought on. In fact, the pastor of the church was a businessman, owned a couple of businesses, and he said, I'm going to sell my businesses, I'm going to retire, I'm going to travel, I'm going to bring the gospel to the world, we're going to start a training center together, and you'll move into the senior pastor position. But in June of 1986, he and his wife sat in our living room and said, we've decided not to sell the businesses. And so I'm sorry to say there's no place for you here. Things are just going to continue. Well, I saw in the spirit a hand, an invisible hand that went like this between us. It was a large hand too. It was like 4 feet long. It just went and split between us. And of course, this threw us for a loop because, I mean, we had bought a house. We had started a couple pizza delivery stores for income while I was served as an associate pastor. So we were set up to move into that position when he sold his businesses. So when he said, I'm not going to do it, in fact, the father told me, he said he's going to lose everything because he's done this. But Barb in particular was shaken up, and she went to spend some time with the Lord. And he said this, and this is what's relevant to you, and it still is good for today. He said this. He said, I tried to work through men's hearts, but they would not allow me. So now I have to go around them. But it will mean a detour for you. However, because it was through no fault of your own, you will remain in my perfect will. I want to say that again because it changed our lives. It did so much for us. He said, I tried to work through men's hearts, but they would not allow me. So I have to work around them. But it will mean a detour for you. But because it was through no fault of your own, you will remain in my perfect will, but it will mean a detour. You see, sometimes people have detours in life. For us, that was June of 1986. We did not leave that church. We did not physically move until March and April, first week of April of the following year, of April of 1987. So you're talking about 10 months later. The cloud had picked up, but it wasn't time to move yet. And during that 10 months, it was agonizing. Finances were difficult. We had to sell our businesses. We wanted to sell our house. All the different things like that. And we're searching, Lord, where are, speak to us, speak to us. It wasn't until March of that following year that I got a phone call about a church needing a pastor. And we just knew it was the timing of the Lord. The Lord had told me at the beginning of the year, be ready to move the end of March and the first week of April. But my point is this, detours happen. And oftentimes it's through no fault of our own. Oftentimes it's the decisions that other people make. And we suffer the consequences. For us, we were almost 6 years in that detour before we got back on track as far as what we felt the Lord was leading us. And it was a difficult 6 years. It was a rich 6 years. It wasn't financially rich, but it was good, rich in the Lord, where we were pastoring that little church. And of course, the church that we had left eventually fell apart. And the pastor had not sold the businesses and went under. And it was a sad situation, but it was like the Lord caused us to escape out of there. So you've got to look at the detours of life sometimes as maybe the Lord is causing you to escape something because somebody else is not following him, and the Father wants to move you out so you don't suffer the consequences. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 says the Lord had spoken to Abram to leave his homeland, to leave his family and everything. And so he went, and it was a journey of over 1,000 miles, over 1,500, 1,600 kilometers. And he went to what is modern-day Israel. And Genesis 12:7 says, the Lord appeared to him and said, this is the land I was speaking of. Now you've got to understand, once again, Abraham was just told, leave your family. And he wasn't told where he was going. There was no sign. There was nothing like, okay, I'm giving you a point on a map to aim for. He was just told, you've got to leave. The cloud has moved, but I'm not telling you where we're going. And so Abraham walked over 1,000 miles before he got to, in Genesis 12:7 says, the Lord appeared to him and said, this is the land I was talking about. And that sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, the Lord appeared to him and said, hey, this is the promised land after 1,000 miles of walking. But the truth of the matter is, you go down to verse 10, and verse 10 says, there was a famine in the land. and Abraham had to move down to Egypt so he could just eat. Isn't that an amazing thing, that he's in the middle of the Lord's perfect will, but there was a famine in the land, and he had to move temporarily just to eat, just to be able to eat, and before he returned to that land. So my point to you today is this, that a famine in the land does not necessarily mean you missed it. Sometimes there are detours to life, and oftentimes the Lord doesn't tell us where we're going. He only gives us partial information. Like he told Abraham, go for a walk, but he didn't tell him where he was going. And it's also interesting, you see another example from Abraham's life in Genesis chapter 15. The Lord, it starts out in saying, the Lord brought him forth abroad in the King James Version. Brought him forth abroad in the Hebrew means, and I heard a rabbi talk about this when he was teaching on this, he said that they were taught in rabbinical school that the brought him forth abroad means that there was a supernatural bringing out into the universe, so that Abraham saw the stars, not just from on the ground with no city lights or anything around, but he brought him forth abroad means it was a spiritual experience up in space, and the Lord said, count the stars and see if you can count them, and that's how many your offspring will be. But Abram said this to the Lord. He said, Lord, seeing what are you going to give me? Seeing that I don't have any heirs, and this Eliezer, the steward, my manager, seems to be in place to inherit everything. And the Lord told him, no, you are going to have a son. Out of your own body will come a son. Now that sounds amazing and wonderful in Genesis 15 that the Lord said that. But that's all he told Abram. So in Genesis chapter 16, it details the fact that Abram and Sarah are talking to one another, or Sarai and Abram at that time, are talking to one another, and Sarah comes up with the brilliant idea of Abraham getting Hagar pregnant. And which he did. He listened to his wife, he got Hagar pregnant, and we had Ishmael as a result. And then in Genesis chapter 17, the Lord appears to Abraham and Sarah and says, oh, Abraham, not only is that child going to come from you, but also I'm going to cause Sarah's womb to come alive, and she's going to have a son. And that was Isaac. And I'm thinking back in Genesis 15, why didn't the Lord just tell Abram back in Genesis 15 that you're going to have a son, and I'm going to cause Sarah's womb to come alive and make, so that you guys can have Isaac, a son of promise? Why did he just tell him partial information in Genesis 15, let them stumble around and eventually get Hagar pregnant with Ishmael before the next chapter in chapter 17 says, oh, by the way, Sarah, you're going to have a son? It's like, where was that information in Genesis 15? Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like the Lord gives you partial information and you go along and you stumble and you fall and you pick up and you're kind of wandering around saying, Lord, are you here? What are we doing? And then the rest of the information comes and you think, where was that at the beginning? I'll tell you what, folks, it wouldn't be a walk of faith if it was spelled out for us. And that's part of what I wanted to share with you today is walking by faith, not by sight. When Abraham had the command, leave your family and leave your nation to a land that I will later show you, our humanness says, I want to know that point on the map where we're headed. But God, in his wisdom, just tells us the command, leave. You know, the cloud has moved. The cloud's picked up and it's going somewhere. I'll tell you later when you get there. That's the part of faith. When the Lord told Abram that child is going to come from your own body, then it's sitting back and watching what Abraham does with that information. And the thing is, we should never try to help God bring his promises to pass. That's what Abraham and Sarah tried to do. I mean, you can hear the conversation if you read between the lines. You know, Abraham's told, hey, it's going to come from your own body. So Abraham and Sarah are talking, saying, now, how is this going to come to pass? You know, Sarah hasn't had any kids. We're past age. They're trying to figure out how God's going to work, and they come up with a brilliant plan to help God by getting Hagar pregnant. You know, you just have to realize that when the Lord gives you partial information, just start walking. Don't look for point A or from point A to point B. Don't sit there and try to scheme in your mind, how might God bring this to pass? Do what is right in the natural. Don't do something immoral, like getting a Hagar pregnant. Don't do something that isn't right. And walk step by step by step, because that's the walk of faith. So a famine in your land does not mean you missed it. It just means there's a famine in the land. And do what you need to do in the natural, but realize down inside, the Lord has led you. He will continue to lead you and guide you and provide for you. You just have to walk by faith. All the questions you have will not be answered on this side. So just walk by faith, step by step, day to day, and let him reveal his plan as you take those steps. All right, God bless. I hope this has been an encouragement for you. There's a little bit of something for everyone out there. Talk to you next week.